This conference will now be recorded.
Great. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Thanks for spending the morning with us. So we have a great lineup of speakers for you today, and we're excited to share with you information to support you and your team and the work that you're doing. My name is Kimberly Cook, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm the Northern California Business Development Manager for Agromin Premium Soil Products. Cecilia Rios is our host, and she's the Supervising Environmental Services Specialist for the City of San Jose. She'll be doing all the behind-the-scenes magic to keep things running smoothly. Today's webinar session is on air permitting, which is session 6 of a 13-part webinar series brought to you for free by the SWANA Gold Rush chapter in Northern California. Our webinar series occurs once a month on a Friday from noon to 1 p.m. Pacific time. These webinars are free to members and non-members, so please let your friends and colleagues know about the series so they can join us as well. Check out our SWANA Gold Rush chapter website on the events page to learn more about the webinar series. You can register for upcoming sessions here, find links to previous sessions, and learn more about opportunities to sponsor our webinar series. If you're not currently receiving webinar announcement emails from us and you'd like to stay plugged in, send us an email at swanagoldrush@gmail.com. Would also love to hear any feedback about today's webinar and any ideas you have for future webinars or anything else you'd like to share. So please send us an email at swanagoldrush@gmail.com. This webinar series is only possible with the dedication and hard work of our SWANA webinar team members, which include Christine Wolffe of Recology, Ruth Abbey with Abbey & Associates, Tim Rabley of HDR Engineers. If you have a SWANA certification that you need to maintain and you're registered for this webinar, you will automatically receive a continuing education unit, also known as a CEU. SWANA provides certification courses in landfill operations, composting programs, HHW, zero waste, and more. So I definitely encourage you to check out SWANA's website to learn more about our certification courses and stay plugged in. SWANA requires all those who are certified through one of our courses to obtain 30 CEUs across 3 years in order to maintain certification. So each of these webinars you'll attend is worth 1 CEU, and if you attend all 13, you'll get 13 CEUs. This webinar series is also only possible with sponsorships from viewers like you. I want to give a sincere thanks to our sponsors for the webinar series, Rethink Waste, Recology, Salinas Valley Solid Waste Authority, and HDR Engineering. Check out our website to learn more about ways that you can sponsor or contact Christine Wolffe for more information. I'm sure by this point we've all used a variety of web-based platforms for conferencing. The platform we're using for this meeting is GoToMeeting. There's a couple things that I'd like to show you specific to this platform that will help improve your experience. So if you look at your screen here, the default setting is to have everyone's pictures up here. So you'll see on the slide here, at the top section, there's a little section with an up-down arrow. You can click there and then view who's talking only or hide everyone, and that'll allow you to focus on the PowerPoint itself and get the best view. Also, if you have any questions during this webinar, you can send them through the chat box. So you'll see on your screen, there's a little bubble to the right-hand side. So if you click there and go down to the bottom, you'll see again the double arrows, and there you can choose if you want to send a question to everyone or if you want to send a question just to the organizers, and Cecilia and I will both get anything sent to the organizers. For the attendees, please make sure that all your mics are muted and that your webcam is turned off. Our speakers today are Greg Wolffe, Principal Scientist at Yorke Engineering, Deepti Jain, Environmental Engineering Coordinator for the City of Sunnyvale, and Patrick Sullivan, Senior Vice President at SES Engineers. After each presenter is finished speaking, I'll ask them a few questions from the chat box, depending if we have any questions at that time. Anyone can post questions. If you have a question specific for a specific speaker, please clarify that in your question, and then I'll take any extra questions at the end, especially if they might apply to everybody. And without further ado, Mr. Wolffe is a principal with Yorke Engineering with over 30 years experience in environmental research and professional consulting services. Mr. Wolffe has supported commercial enterprises and government organizations in assessing air quality impacts for large multi-year new facility construction projects and major and minor source facility modifications, optimized projects for emission reduction credits with permitting agencies, conducted air dispersion modeling analysis to evaluate potential impacts on state and federal ambient air quality standards, evaluated toxic air contaminant emissions for health risk assessments, and proposed project mitigation. He has also managed the installation of many ambient air monitoring networks and site-specific source testing programs for permitting and rule compliance. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
Okay, take it off mute. Thanks, Kimberly, and I want to thank the SWANA Gold Rush chapter for hosting this webinar series. It's very important. My topic today is going to be air permitting as it relates to the organics waste industry. I have a brief agenda. It'll go pretty quick. Organic waste drivers, then we're looking at what kind of facilities will be needed to implement the key legislation, what air quality impacts may come from that, emissions quantification methods, then we'll talk a little bit about monitoring and source testing, and wrap it up with some strategies for permitting. As many of you know, the seminal legislation in California that kicked off a lot of the organic waste recovery and recycling program is SB 1383. So there were some predecessor regulations or assembly bills that went before that, but after SB 1383, there's been a lot of downstream, a lot of subsequent legislation that has sought to refine the initiative and to put some more boundaries around where things will go, where the diversion will occur. And part of it, and I guess the important part, is that CalRecycle has also changed. They have seen the need over the years to get more involved and develop investment strategies around how to make these goals accomplishable by the state and by the individual stakeholders. So they're more involved, and part of their mission also is to bring in other utilities like the Utilities Commission as well as CARB to allow even more extended use of various organic processing options. So we'll start with what are some of the organic waste streams. So generally, and of course everyone has kind of a different way to cut the cut the bread, if you will, but generally we have organic waste as a wet stream and a dry stream. There's options within the wet stream, which would include sources like food waste and green waste and some papers for anaerobic digestion. And a lot of that can also go to composting and historically, less so now, landfill applications. The dry organic stream is a little bit more woody. It has landscaping materials, pruning, stuff like that that come in. And those options for recovery are more around thermal conversion, looking at chipping and grinding operations that would then either supplement or could be part of a biomass conversion project. So the facilities that need to receive or recover this organic waste will come in a variety of forms. One of them will be transfer facilities. Those are already obviously ubiquitous. They're all over the place, but they're going to be more important because some of those will become processing centers or pre-sorting centers for diversion. Then also there'll be more need for chipping and grinding facilities, areas to then do post-processing, which is like composting. And then importantly, conversion technologies will become an increasingly important part of the picture as technology improves and there can be more useful, beneficial use out of organic waste products. So types of facilities, where will these facilities be? likely they'll be somewhat where they are now. There's going to be modifications to existing sites that will expand the existing capacities of the existing facilities. A lot of that is just the convenience of having those zoning and land use approvals already in place. There'll be some new facility construction, of course, they'll go with it. Those might be a little longer lead item because of the authorities that need to be approving that. But one thing I think is something that in the SB 1383 regulation, if you look at it, one thing that is pretty clear is going to require is that there's going to need to be an expansion of the existing commercial collection of organics system. And that was something that was identified as part of the CalRecycle analysis for local services earlier this year. So now we know where the facilities are going to be. We know what they are. What are some of the air quality impacts associated with them? Well, the air pollution pollutants that are most common that we all kind of recognize the name of include what are so-called criteria air pollutants. So those will be volatile organic compounds. Those occur from just about any of the organic processing operations. Particulate matter, that would be PM, PM10, and PM2.5. Those come from material handling operations as well as some of the on-site truck travel. And then combustion sources also, like for example, if there's a biogas combustion project, those will also emit combustion products such as nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, as well as PM and VOCs. In addition to those, we have air toxics, which are emitted from the organics handling as well. Those would be ammonia, sulfur compounds, formaldehyde, things like that. And that has been the traditional air pollution impacts. However, there is also now, and it's gaining a little more notice in the public, odors. Odors are not directly measured. They're measured through odor nuisance regulations. Odor nuisance, well, nuisance in general is actually in the California Health and Safety Code, and also has in every air district their own rule that implements the health and safety code's prohibition on nuisance, which includes odors. Of course, the challenge here is that odors don't have an ambient air quality standard associated with it. There's no threshold per se for it. Some planning organizations try to put some boundaries around odors, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But in general, odors are something that is, even though it's not as easy to qualify or quantify, it is becoming increasingly part of the permitting landscape, because air agencies, when they issue permits, part of their charter is to be able to issue permits that will not cause or contribute to a public nuisance and will protect the public health and welfare. So it's become part of their their list of things to look at for permitting new facilities or expansion of facilities will be odor impacts. So once you look at these air pollutants and we look at how they're used, we identify them in various categories. We use those air emissions for permitting purposes under new source review. That is that's a program under the Clean Air Act. We also use them for looking at BAAQMD, which is best available control technology, and offsets. And then for toxics, we look at impacts from health risk. Also, if the project is a new authorization or requires new land use authorization, it might any kind of discretionary permit would be also potentially subject to CEQA analysis. And here we have again odor impacts. That's how some of these now, of course, odors, even though it's fairly a generic odor, they do come from chemical compounds. I mean, that's what causes odor. So emissions of chemical compounds is part of how odor impacts are evaluated and how they're used. So how do we protect against this, or how do we prepare for this list during the project planning stage? Well, we start by defining the project, which includes what's the inputs, the processing, and the outputs. So the organic streams coming in, have to be fairly well defined. Now, an initial project may not have all of these aspects in the feedstock. Food waste or manure may not be part of what is contracted or envisioned for that facility. But in many cases, these feedstocks share common control requirements. So part of the strategy around looking at defining a project would be making it as flexible as possible in terms of the receiving the organic streams to be processed. We look at then what the process descriptions will be, what our appropriate best available control or BAAQ design is, and then what our process unit operations are, what are the key components of the operation. And then very important will be the process rate. These are usually both in terms of a maximum daily annual throughput, because as we all know, agencies permit to a potential. But we also look at the normal operations to determine what we'd be seeing. And things like odor, for example, may be something that is flexible in terms of where you look at the highest impacts coming from, whether it be a maximum daily or a normal operation or an upset condition. So here we have defined the projects, and now we're going to go into what kind of quantification methods we can use. Generally, we talk about methods for quantification as either direct measurement, which will be source measurement, right? Source testing, or some of you might be familiar with what's called a continuous emissions monitoring system, or a CEMS. Other ways to quantify emissions include engineering calculations. So that would be equations that are used to predict emissions based on other similar processes and emission factors, such as AP42 from referenced or published materials. And then this last one, air pollution control efficiency, when we talk about controls, especially within like an enclosure, which is common, an enclosure has usually, if it has some kind of a ventilation system on it, what that will create is, of course, a collection. It'll create a draw across that building, which will be a vacuum, and that will increase the capture. Well, whatever's captured goes to the control device, so the control device then stays 95% effective. But many times the agencies now will talk about overall control efficiency, which means the percent of capture times the percent control equals the overall control. So that becomes part of the quantification method, is looking at overall air pollution control efficiency. Now, looking at how we measure this in terms of air monitoring, we look at ambient air. Air monitoring instrumentation is commonly used to take samples of ambient air. So that would be public air or air space. You can grab samples using a SUMA canister or other kind of collection equipment and have those sent to a lab for very specific chemical analysis. Like, for example, if you wanted to look at what your organic profile was, you can do a specific speciation. Also available is odor meters or olfactometers, such as the Nasal Ranger. And here they talk about a dilution to threshold. I mentioned earlier that there isn't really standards per se for ambient air levels of odor. However, in some cases, some agencies look at olfactometers and DT thresholds for CEQA, and they may also apply that for odor impacts. Another way to look at potentially that would be through concentrations of chemical compounds at a defense line to determine if there's going to be a potential odor. Also, we've established networks in the past that have helped to do some preliminary work to see what kind of existing conditions look like. So we can then, under the permitting, we permit just the incremental increase above that. In contrast to air monitoring, which is an ambient air measurement, we also have emissions source testing. So source testing is at the source itself. This is what's being released to the air from the source. And generally, we're talking about releases in two different ways. There's either surface level releases that are common for composting or biofilters, think of a landfill, or those can be collected or captured and vented through a stack, which can also facilitate the use of emission control technology. It could be carbon, it could be a odor neutralizing agent. It could be other things. But it's important to keep these in mind as options for when you go to that initial project definition we talked about. How do we set up this release so that we can accomplish what we want to do, and also that to get the air permit agency to be able to accept the design and permit it without a lot of back and forth. One of the things we can do with the ventilated stack release is we can also do modeling to ensure or to give the agency some level of confidence that we have appropriately not going to cause an impact, whether it be for an air contaminant, toxic air contaminant, whether it be for a combustion source or odors. So this is a very simple demonstration, but it kind of shows the point. Close-in stacks tend to have a greater downwash, the cavity around buildings, whereas if you elevate the stack, that dispersion can help a lot in terms of getting the project to be permitted. Some of the requirements then that we've looked at for permitting really revolve around the quantification method that would be beneficial for source-specific emission factors. What this does is a couple things. First, it obviously makes it's more representative of your particular operation, but it also typically involves more engagement with the agency early on in the process, because often a source test protocol needs to be submitted and approved, and at that point the agency is already starting to get an indication of what that project looks like, because they're approving a source test protocol that's intended to measure the equipment emissions. You could also end up getting a much better and lower emission factors as a result of that. And they can also help for the toxics evaluation and potentially also odor assessment. We've also found that it's a balancing act. It's important to be able to balance the requirements of the air district with the other permitting agencies, the CalRecycle and the Water Board, and that the requirements to process for the monitoring do vary quite a bit by district. So again, getting in front of that agency early is important. If there is a control device that is proposed, they're going to almost assuredly want some sort of source test to be conducted to verify the control efficiency of the proposed equipment. And then monitoring parameters, including location and frequency. Those are very key requirements that almost all permits now have some form of monitoring requirement. Our last final thoughts on this is that what we found is that the cost to comply with these requirements can be sometimes substantial. So it's very important to get as much upfront as we can in terms of negotiating reasonable conditions with the agency. Site-specific source tests by a source testing company can go a long way to reducing emissions upfront, in other words, lowering the quantification emission estimates, and be a good investment in the long run. Planning is key because these are long lead time projects. We have had many that go on the 2-year window. That's not uncommon at all. So lots of planning, lots of timelines to keep to be in front of. And probably one of the most important things is early and continuous engagement with the agency. That's key to avoid surprises down the road. And with that, it's my final slide.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you very much.
Deepti Jain is our next speaker. Deepti has over 12 years of experience in the field of air quality compliance and permitting in the public sector. In April 2019, Ms. Jain joined City of Sunnyvale Solid Waste Division as Environmental Engineering Coordinator. In her current role, she verifies and ensures the city's compliance with environmental regulations and permits issued by CalRecycle, BAAQMD, and CARIB. She leads the city's response efforts on SB 1383 and BAAQMD Reg 13-2 and 13-3, and represents the City of Sunnyvale in the technical work group formulated by the Air District Reg for 13-2 and 13-3. the organic material handling and composting operations. From 2008 to March of 2019, she has worked on enforcement and implementation of air quality regulations at the Air District. She has an extensive knowledge of the state and local regulatory framework application to landfills, transfer stations, and composting operations, and was an integral part of the core rule development efforts related to the solid waste regulations. Deepti, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Kimberly. Now that the secret is out that I have switched sides, let me tell you, it was because of one of our SWANA Gold Rush Chapter core member that I did that. And thank you, Mark, for that. And with that, I will start my presentation on Air District Reg 13.2, Organic Material Handling Operations and its impact on the solid waste industry. So how this rule came into existence. In 2017-18, Air District came up with their clean air plan, adopted that clean air plan, and under that methane strategy was adopted. And under umbrella of Reg 13, climate pollutants 5 set of rules were formulated. And these are mainly for methane, minimizing methane and VOCs from emissions from these sources, and mainly landfills, refineries, and organic material handling operations are the key sources identified here. I'll be focusing on Reg 13.2, which is organic material handling operation, and a little bit on 13.3, composting operations. These two rules are ongoing. Other rules are either on hold or conceptual level, except 13.5, for which draft language rule has been published by the Air District. So what's the purpose of 13.2 and how it impacts us? That's the key, right? So 13.2, the goal is to minimize methane and VOC emissions from organic material handling facilities, mainly MRFs, whether it's a clean or dirty MRF, transfer station, and chipping and grinding facilities. How they came up with who is going to be subject to this rule, right? That's filtering of applicability is the key. For them, Air District said that any facility that receives, handles, stores, or distributes and transfers more than 10,000 tons per year, that's the previous rules limit, and I'll talk about that in a bit, of organic material, including MSW, food waste, or yard waste, or a combination of these, will be subject to this rule. Another driving factor for this rule was Air District between 2017 and 1920 received thousands and thousands of odor complaints from Greater Milpitas and Richmond areas, and some complaints from South Bay too. And as Greg mentioned, that most of these were alleging composting operation, and composting is not in Air District jurisdiction. So to handle these complaints, they investigated, but you cannot quantify an odor, right? So they said, okay, we will come up with the rule, a set of standards. That way we can tackle all these odor complaints. And on top of that, Air District Board, which is comprised of all the supervisors nominated, selected, and represent 9 Bay Area counties on Air District Board, they were pushing for a solution. They wanted a solution, a permanent solution. So Air District staff, they said, okay, let's rush and adopt this rule as quickly as we can. So they said that we will adopt this rule by 2020. So as you can imagine, with this hasty approach, hush-hush approach, a lot went wrong. Mainly, they were trying to tackle odors by regulating methane and VOCs from transfer station and processing operation without any baseline emission standards or cost benefit analysis. Without any baseline, they were saying, oh, you need to make all these changes on your site, but we won't tell you how many emissions are coming from your site. They rushed and combined 2 rules together. In the beginning, when these rules were released, compost was separate rule and MRF and transfer stations was a separate rule. But because they were so rush to come up with a solution, they combined these two rules. And as a result, composting operation standards, emission standards were imposed on transfer stations and MRFs. So imagine a transfer station operation, which is so different than composting operation. Without understanding that difference, they said, no, you need to operate like a composting operation. And on top of that, they said that once the rule is adopted, you have only 6 months to fix everything on your site, do all the analysis, do all the initial source testing, construction, CEQA analysis, permitting, and that rule will be effective from 6 months. So that means if in January it's adopted, by July 1st, everything should be in place. And if it's not, you will be in violation. And industry, they responded really strong against this rule. The industry submitted more than 75 comment letters to the Air District during the comment period. And when Air District, who typically have their stationary source committee meetings in San Francisco, they held one in October 2019 in Milpitas City Hall, industry folks showed up. And I remember clearly that day it was pouring so hard, but still so many folks from industry showed up and told the board that this rule is impossible to implement. We want to reduce emissions. We are with you, but it has to be a logical approach, right? But they were at that point, I think, with the board, board supported industry, and Air District put a hold on that rule, both rules at that point. So in just the main areas of concern that stakeholders provided to the Air District is that it has a lot of operational implications. This rule cannot be adopted the way it's written. It's impossible to have stockpiles on a tipping floor and label and dimension and take temperature of each load that comes in on the tipping floor. Imagine someone climbing up, your sorter climbing up on a pile of that fluffy material and taking temperature, and then making sure that each pile is not more than 20 feet by 20 feet by 10 feet. And you have to do all of that without any baseline data, no scientific basis. You have to enclose your building and adopt 80% control efficiency, emission control efficiency abatement systems, whether it's a wet scrubber or carbon filter. Maybe you have to enclose your whole building under negative pressure, and you have to do all of this within 6 months. They fail to understand what will be the economic burden on the facilities. As Greg mentioned, these things, they cost millions and millions of dollars. They fail to understand that. And ultimately, who's going to pay that? Ratepayers, right? They don't care about that. And on top of that, they fail to understand that this works against SB 1383. SB 1383 tells us that, oh, you need to divert more and more organics away from the landfills. You need to expand your capacity, but this rule will force us to reduce our capacity, limit our operations so that we can stay within the building and enclose that enclosed structure. So in nutshell, since 17, when the Clean Air Plan was adopted till March, when rule was put on hold, lot of back and forth went between facilities and Air District. And then ultimately in September of this year, they said that they want to re-engage with the stakeholders. And this time their approach is much more slow. They're listening to the industry, and they have come up with a three-prong approach. First step is that they will discuss BMP in place at the facilities, and they are asking stakeholders, tell me what works at your site, and we are giving them that feedback. Second stage will be that these BMPs will be adopted, and then they will be the base for permit condition formulation. Then after that, they will come up with emission standards based on different case studies. I am hoping that. And the third final step will be actual rule language adoption. They haven't told us what will be the timeline for last 2 stages, but so far they've told that tentatively in December of this year, they will release a BMP guidance document. So guys, look out for that. And to summarize what needs to be done so that they get it right this time, I think they have learned from the past, and the approach which lacks right now more data analysis, research, emission standard needs to be there. They need to have a more rational approach behind those standards, not one fit for all kind of approach, but curtail it based on the requirements and the site. It has to be more realistic implementation timeline, not 6 months. Typically, it takes 3 to 5 months to get the permitting done. That's like for air district permit only. And we have to think about the water board permit from LEA. So they have to think about all of that. They have to consider a more tiered permitting approach, which is based on the throughput and material processed, and better define organic streams that are there. And they should be aligned with calorie cycle definitions. So they need to understand that MRF transfer stations are not a methane source. We have tried to tell them multiple times, we are not a methane source. We don't have material sitting in one location for a long period of time. At transfer stations and MRFs, the material is moved within 24 hours to 48 hours. And for VOC emission, they need to come up with standards which are realistic. They need to understand the impact on our operations, how this rule will change how we operate, how long it takes to get a permit, and ultimately what will be the cost, which is a big factor for us. What will be the cost to recycle material? What will be the cost ultimately on ratepayers, and implications, financial implications? We have multiple year contracts, right, in organic industry, and they need to understand that we just cannot change the way we operate. So I hope that they understand this time in second round that what industry wants and what works for the industry. And I'm an optimistic person, so I'm hoping they will listen to us in this round. First round they didn't, so hopefully in second round they will get it right. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepti. And just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll make sure to ask them. Patrick Sullivan has over 30 years of experience in environmental consulting, specializing in air quality, greenhouse gas, risk assessment, landfill gas issues. He is a Senior Vice President and Managing Director for SES Consulting and Engineering Operations in the Southwestern U.S. He is also SES's National Expert on the Clean Air Act and oversees national disciplines for greenhouse gas and risk assessment. He has published and or presented over 120 technical papers in industry publications and conferences. Thanks for being with us, Patrick.
Thank you, Kimberly. Welcome, everyone. We're going to shift from organics facilities to landfills and talk specifically about all of the plethora of federal air regulations for landfills that we're trying to deal with and make sense of, and EPA has added to our mix of regulations recently, and that's created more confusion for us as an industry as we try to figure out what we need to do to comply. So let's start with the rules. The old rules that we've been working under really since 1996 are the original new source performance standards. The original emission guidelines, which were a sister regulation to the NSPS, that were either implemented via a federal plan or via various state rules that EPA would approve. And finally, we had a landfill NESHAP rule, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, that was promulgated in 2003, and that took effect in 2004. So we've really been dealing with these regulations, and I think we've got ourselves in a pretty good position of compliance relative to these regulations. However, that has changed, and we now have a new batch of regulations to deal with, both under the NSPS and the NESHAP programs. So in 2016, EPA passed another set of new source performance standard and emission guideline rules for landfills. We have a handful of states that have approved rules, and there's a draft version of a federal plan that has not been issued yet, so that's still in limbo. And just this year, EPA issued a revised NESHAP rule for landfills in March of this year, and that's the newest installment of federal air regs that we're trying to make sense of. So the key dates to remember, originally the date was May 30th, 1991, and that would, if you either were a new landfill or you modified after that date, you became a new site and therefore subject to the new source performance standard. Otherwise, you're an existing site and subject to the emission guideline, most likely through your state or local version of that rule. With the new set of regulations, we have a new date, a new cutoff date, and that's July of 2014. So any landfill that modified or was new after July 17, 2014, you are now subject to the new source performance standard. And but if you haven't, you're existing and you're subject to your state EG rule. Although most places around the country are waiting to see when that rule is going to happen. Most of these we refer to them through their subpart letter codes, so there's quite a bit of alphabet soup there. So as we move forward, I'll be referencing them by the various subparts noted here. So lawsuits have been filed, and both from industry as well as from states pushing back on EPA. Originally, industry filed the first suit after the new batch of NSPS and EG rules were promulgated, and they did receive a temporary stay for implementation of the rules. Unfortunately, that did run out, but industry did get a commitment from EPA to reconsider those rules and try to address some of the comments that EPA has had. At that time, EPA agreed informally that they wouldn't move forward with approving the various state plans for the new emission guideline rules, and in fact, most states didn't even submit them. However, certain states, including California, sued EPA saying that you're required to do this, so you need to move forward, and that actually forced EPA to get back on track to approving these rules, and states started to submit them. So now we have seen a small amount of states that have approved rules. Any state that doesn't have an approved rule would ultimately fall under the federal plan, but EPA actually won a court case recently that allowed them to continue to delay the issuance of the federal plan. So that remains in limbo as we speak. And so at this point, we're waiting on various states as they move forward with their state plans and get them approved by EPA. So while this was all happening, and we're trying to work these out with EPA, EPA actually went forward and issued a NESHAP rule. Part of this was something they were required to do, as they're required to periodically update these rules, and the old one was from 2003. But they decided they were going to try to help us by issuing a blanket rule that would actually incorporate all the NSPS and EG standards into those rules, so there'd be somewhat of a one-stop shop. Unfortunately, they didn't do a very good job, and we believe that they have created more confusion with this new regulation, and they've certainly created yet another overlapping regulation with similar requirements. Industry commented heavily on this rule when it was drafted in 2019, but EPA really didn't take any of those comments into consideration. So while EPA is planning to reconsider the NSPS and EG rules as they've committed to, that's been pushed off to 2022. But in the meantime, we're going to have to comply with this NESHAP rule because it is officially issued a federal rule. So what are we doing now? So we do have some landfills that did modify their facilities, increase the capacity of the landfill, and are now subject to the new NSPS rule under subpart XXX. And so we're dealing with that, even though there's still some confusion, but that still remains a pretty small handful. We do have some states with approved rules, and so we do have some landfills in those states that are having to move forward with compliance. As I said earlier, the federal plan is on hold, so at this point, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But the main thing we're trying to do is figure out what to do with this NESHAP rule between now and when it becomes fully applicable for landfills. So we're definitely in a state of limbo at this point. So briefly, a little bit of a recap. I'm not going to read all this slide, but I'm going to highlight a couple things. What were the big changes from the old to the new NSPS and NESHAP rules? The one change was the NMOC emission threshold that would require you to put in a landfill gas system. That was reduced from 50 megagrams per year to 34. So obviously that will capture some smaller landfills, as well as require certain landfills to comply earlier than they would have. They also added an additional option to defer the requirement to put in a gas system, and it involves doing surface emissions monitoring. So if you can show that you can meet the surface emission standards without complying with the rule, then you may be able to continue to defer that requirements. They updated the wellhead standards. Previously, we had to monitor for oxygen, temperature, and pressure or vacuum. And the new standards actually remove the oxygen standard, although you do have to continue to monitor for it. But the temperature standard and the negative pressure standard remain in the rule. Surface emission standards were updated as well. The biggest thing was they incorporated a provision from the California regulation that required not only the serpentine path walked across the surface of the landfill, but also to monitor every penetration to the cover during each monitoring event. And finally, one of the big issues is that the NSPS rules used to have an exemption in them that if during periods of startup, shutdown, or malfunction, you basically were exempt from the regulation. There couldn't be non-compliance during that window, but that has changed, and changed drastically to the point now where you have to comply with the regulation at all times, including periods of startup, shutdown, and malfunction. So definitely some new things. I think all in all, they're very similar regulations. I think the biggest part was that EPA did a very poor job of clearly defining the off-ramps from the old rule versus the on-ramps to the new rule. And we actually had some situations where sites appeared to be continue to be subject to both, just because of the way EPA wrote those regulations. So let's move on to the NESHAP rule. We're just starting to get our arms around this and what it requires. But as I noted, they pulled in the new versions of the NSPS and EG rules into that standard. It's a combination rule, so it contains the old portion of the regulation and the new portion together with delineations of when they take effect. So from now until September 27th of 2021, so next year, it's business as usual. Keep complying with the older version of the rule. Starting in September of 2021, the new version takes effect. It added some additional general provisions that didn't exist before, some notification requirements and what's called a performance evaluation plan that'll have to be prepared and implemented relative to the monitoring devices, so the flow monitoring and temperature monitoring that we do. Just like the NSPS rules, the SSM requirements are removed. You can opt in early, though as an industry, we're not recommending that, but maybe there may be reasons on a case-by-case basis why you may want to consider that. And as an interesting note, even though they lowered the threshold for the NSPS rule, they didn't for the NESHAP rule. So this creates an interesting sort of subcategory of sites that would be subject to the new NSPS and EG rules at 34 megagrams per year, but would not actually be subject to the NESHAP rule. So EPA said they were streamlining this rule and trying again to create this nice hybrid rule that combined all the requirements into one. We just don't think they did a great job of it. But it does not completely replace the NSPS and EG rules. Compliance with the major provisions of the NESHAP, mostly as those relate to the landfill gas system and the monitoring, will be deemed to be compliance with the NSPS and EG, but there are some elements the NSPS and EG rules that are unique. So you still are complying with both sets of rules. One of the big changes is they've raised the wellhead temperature from that was previously 131 degrees as a threshold to 145 degrees. So that will be helpful for many landfills that were struggling to comply with the 131. However, good things don't always come with seems like the other side of the coin, and if you do go over wells over 145 degrees, you have enhanced monitoring that did not exist in the previous rules, including as much as weekly monitoring for certain parameters for those wells. And at 165 degrees, additional monitoring comes into play, and then the ultimate limit is 170 degrees, where you can't exceed that number. The NSPS rules all have a phase-in window of effectively 30 months. You submit your documentation, you say you're subject to the rule, and then you have a 30-month window before you fully comply with all the provisions. The NESHAP rule doesn't have that, so presumably on September 27, 2021, we have to start complying with it. So I think we do need to be ready for that, and I think we're going to be spending the next 3 to 6 months figuring out what that is. Because we have a lot of states that have not gotten their EG rules done under the new program, and they're still lagging, and because EPA is not issuing the federal plan at this point, we could have some landfills that actually transition from the old rules directly into the NESHAP. Unfortunately, the rule never envisioned that, so it creates a situation where you may still have to comply with the old regulations, which is yet one of those other issues that we think EPA did not get right. So our industry group is still figuring this out. So we you know, all of our experts that get together, and we get together monthly to talk about it, and we're still confused. And frankly, if we're all confused, then I can guarantee probably a lot of you are confused. So hopefully over the next several months, come to some consensus on how we're going to approach the rule and what we're going to do going forward. So where are we at with the emission guidelines? As I mentioned, and I'm just going to focus on the western states here. So Arizona has submitted 3 plans for 3 of their jurisdictions, Maricopa County, Pinal County, and the rest of the state. 2 of them have been approved, but the Maricopa County plan has been withdrawn. So in those other jurisdictions, in Arizona, we are having to move forward with compliance with the new EG rule. California, interestingly enough, took a very unique approach. They said, we think our existing landfill methane rule under AB 32 is more stringent than the federal rule. So that's what we propose as our EG rule. We thought that was actually a very good idea, so we didn't have that overlap. Unfortunately, EPA didn't fully approve that. They issued a partial approval, partial disapproval, and the reasons is, although the California rule is stringent in many ways, it doesn't actually have every piece of the federal rule in it. So CARB has some requirements that they're going to have to revise and resubmit to get the entire rule fulfilled. But in the meantime, keep complying with the landfill methane rule. You have to do that anyways. So, and keep complying with whatever federal regulation you're subject to until that gets resolved. New Mexico's plans have been approved as well. And so they are moving forward. And the most recent approval here on the West Coast is Oregon's plan was just approved. And so Oregon sites are going to have to start complying as well. So in this limbo period that we find ourselves in, you know, what should we be doing? So if you trigger the subpart XXX, that's the new NSPS, because you expand your landfill, you need to comply. It's a federal regulation. There's nothing else that can be done. But we do recommend that you work out a clear transition from the old to the new rules with the agency you're working under, and maybe even do a closeout report for the old rule, so there's a clear dividing line between when old and new. That rule does have a 30-month phase-in, so even though you could argue you're ready to comply on day one because there's not that much has changed, we recommend you use the full 30 months, work out the kinks, make sure you've got everything in place, get whatever alternatives you need to get approved, and so make use of that because the rule allows it. If you happen to find yourself in a jurisdiction with an approved EG rule under the new program, again, you have to comply, and there'll be the timelines though will be based on the approval, EPA's approval of that state rule, and then there'll be the timelines will flow from there. So those will be on a different schedule than the NSPS sites. For the remaining sites, keep complying with the old version of the NSPS or EG rule that you currently do. Keep tracking that EG rule in your jurisdiction to see when it's going to get finalized and approved by EPA. And then keep tracking, which we all will be doing, the federal plan, because if that gets published and becomes effective, then all the remaining sites that have not transitioned would transition at that point, even regardless of whether there's a state rule or not. For all sites, though, that are subject to an NSPS and EG rule and over that 50 megagram threshold, then for the near term, keep complying with the old version of the NESHAP rule and doing all the things that requires. Primarily, that was complying with the startup shutdown and malfunction plan and doing specific reporting. Again, we're not advocating a blanket opt-in, but that is an option, and so you might want to discuss that with your team or your consultant to see whether opt-in is a good idea for your site. And then come September of 2021, be ready to comply with the NESHAP rule and all that it entails, which will effectively pull you into the new NSPS rules, even if you haven't yet transitioned. As I said, we have some work to do in the coming months to figure out the best strategy for that, and hopefully we'll be able to give some guidance to the industry on what the plan is. If you're in California, as I said earlier, keep complying with the landfill methane rule. If that's applicable to you, you obviously have no choice there anyways. Let's keep tracking CARB's resubmittal to get approval of the items that they were deficient. And then we're all going to be, like I said, preparing for the compliance with the new NESHAP rule and all that entails. So I've got some charts here. I'm not going to read the detail of them, but these are meant to kind of give a roadmap to transitioning from the where you stand now in terms of your NSPS EG status to how you transition into the new rules and the new NESHAP rule. The first slide here shows if you're an existing site, so these are landfills that haven't modified since July of 2014, and here are the different categories and how you would potentially transition from one to the other. And the SWANA will be making these slides available, so you'll be able to make use of these tables for your site. And then the second one is for the new sites. So these are sites that did modify after July of 2014 and therefore have become a new site under the NSPS subpart XXX requirement. And therefore, again, you'll have your transitional process, and it does depend on where your NMOC emissions stand. So with that, hopefully I've shed some light. Though I do think some confusion still reigns and we still have some things to work out. If you have further questions, obviously we will be answering some questions here shortly, but also my contact details are here. I'm always open to answering questions as you need. If you want to email me, I will be glad to supply some supplemental information for you. So with that, I'm done, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Patrick. And for any of the speakers, if any of the attendees do want the contact info and you missed it, like Patrick mentioned, it will be on the website. You can also email us, and we're happy to send that to you as well. Now we're at time now. I did have one question come in, so I'm going to pose the question, and then we'll wrap up for the day. The question is directed to, one second. Hang on. Cecilia, can you take the screen back? The question is directed to Deepti. How does the BAAQMD deal with the cost effectiveness in its rule development?
They don't. Simple answer is they don't. They don't think about how much it's going to cost to implement any of the changes. as far as the emissions are concerned, you may get more information in statement of basis that's done during the engineering evaluation process, but at such the rule itself, I haven't seen any rule that has where they have told us how much it's going to cost us to implement a rule. I hope that answers your question, Greg.
And
Thanks,
Deepti, I
Deepti.
only read
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Greg. I only read part of the question and then was doing other stuff. So did we cover that whole question that was posted?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. And I got one last one I'm going to go ahead and throw in. So also for Deepti, what do you think of the BAAQMD TWG progress so far? Deepti, did you hear the question?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so for technical working group, there is only one done so far for composting operation. It looks like they're listening to us, but how much they're going to actually take that feedback and use it in rule formulation, we don't know that yet. Hopefully in next few months, when we talk to them more, we will understand their game plan better. Right now we had met with them only once, and so next meeting is on November 12th on operations of smart station, sorry, not smart station, that's where I work, for MRF and transfer stations in general. And hopefully they will understand the BMPs in place and use them in formulating BMP guidance document.
All right, thanks, Deepti. And a sincere thanks to all of our speakers today for taking their time, effort, and energy to present this information to our SWANA membership. And thanks to Cecilia for her help as the host. As always, I have posted on the screen here, these are the other webinars coming up in the coming months and the ones that we've done in the past as well. Check out our website, send questions our way, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thanks very much and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
And Cecilia, can you stop the recording? I'm not able to do it for some reason. It doesn't like me today. Cecilia, are you able to stop the recording? I can't unmute myself. Okay, no worries. I'm just going to end it. Last time I did that, it saved, so